Don't touch me there. Please, I'm begging you. Don't touch me there. Don't touch me there. Please, I'm begging you. Don't touch me there. Temperance Caldwell had sobbed those exact words to every man who'd ever cornered her in Pennsylvania. Her 6 feet 3 inches frame trembling with terror despite her giant size because her father, a cruel reverend who should have protected her, had spent 26 years convincing her that her body was a shameful mistake, that any man's touch would be violent punishment for being born too tall, too strong, too freakishly wrong for this world. But now she lay barefoot in the golden Montana grass, wearing a wedding dress that actually fit her magnificent frame, her innocent heart pounding as her new husband, gentle rancher Ezekiel Thornwood, knelt beside her with his weathered, calloused hand, hovering just inches from her waist, and the words that came out of her mouth shattered them both. No one's ever touched me there. Not like they loved me, not like I mattered, not like I was something precious instead of something broken. Tears streamed down her face as she stared up at this patient, tender man who'd looked at his giant mail-order bride like she hung the moon and stars. And Zeke's voice cracked with emotion when he whispered back, "Then let me be the first, Temperance. Let me show you what gentle feels like. Let me prove that safe is real." Every wall she'd built around her wounded heart began to crumble in that sun-drenched field. Because this wasn't just about physical touch. This was about a woman who'd been told her entire life that she was too much, too big, too unlovable. Finally finding a man who saw her giant frame and thought, perfect. Who saw her innocent fear and thought, I'll wait forever. Who saw her brokenness and thought, I'll spend my life making her whole. But this beautiful moment in the golden grass wasn't where their story began. 6 months earlier, Temperance had stood on a train platform in Pennsylvania with a single battered trunk and a one-way ticket to Montana, running from a father who just tried to marry her off to a 60-year-old farmer who'd looked at her like livestock he was purchasing. "You should be grateful," Reverend Josiah Caldwell had hissed at her the night before, his thin fingers digging into her arm hard enough to bruise. "No decent man wants a giant freak for a wife. Brother Hutchkins is doing charity work, taking you on. You'll submit to whatever he requires, and you'll thank God someone was willing." The way Hutchkins had looked at her during Sunday service, his eyes crawling over her body with something that made her skin feel dirty, had sent Temperance to the general store to secretly buy a newspaper. Her hands had shaken as she'd circled advertisements in the matrimonial section, and one had jumped out at her like a lifeline. "Widowed rancher in Montana Territory seeks partner for life on the frontier. Must be strong, capable, and willing to work hard. Height and appearance unimportant, seeking good heart and steady hands. Height unimportant." Those 2 words had made her cry right there in the store. She'd written to the address that very night, and when Ezekiel Thornwood had written back 3 weeks later, his letter hadn't asked about her measurements for dresses, or whether she knew how to make herself pleasing to a man. Instead, he'd asked about her favorite books, whether she liked horses, and if she'd be lonely so far from Pennsylvania. "I won't lie to you, Miss Caldwell," he'd written in careful script. "Mont is hard country, and I'm not a rich man. But I can promise you respect, patience, and a partnership where your voice matters as much as mine. If that sounds like something you'd want, I'll send train fare." She'd written back the same day, and 2 weeks later, she was rattling west on the Northern Pacific Railway with her father's final words burning in her ears. "You'll be back within a month, begging forgiveness. No man can tolerate a freak like you for long." The stagecoach that brought her from Helena to Elk Ridge had been cramped and miserable, her knees jammed against the seat in front of her, the other passengers staring and whispering. But when the coach finally stopped in front of a timber frame house with mountains rising purple in the distance and a tall man stepped off the porch removing his hat, Temperance had felt something shift in her chest. Ezekiel Thornwood wasn't a young man, maybe 32 or 33, with lines around his eyes from squinting into sun and wind. But he had kind eyes, and when he'd looked up at her unfolding from that stagecoach, she'd seen something in his face she'd never seen before. Not disgust, not pity, just wonder. "Miss Caldwell," he'd said quietly, and his voice was gentle like creek water over stones. "Welcome to Montana. I hope your journey wasn't too difficult." It was long, she'd managed to whisper, unable to meet his eyes, because her father had taught her that looking at men directly was brazen, and brazen women got what they deserved.
The stagecoach driver had laughed then, a mean sound that made her stomach clench.
Good luck with that one, Thornwood. Hope you got a sturdy bed frame. You're going to need it with a giant like her. The driver's laughter had echoed across the valley as the coach pulled away.
Intemperance had wanted to fold herself in half, to disappear, to be anywhere but standing there with shame burning her face. But Zeke had simply picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing and said, "Don't mind Jack Turner. He's got a mouth that runs faster than his horses in half the sense.
Come inside, Miss Coldwell. You must be hungry and we should talk."
The house was simple but clean, with windows that caught the last golden light of day and a stone fireplace that looked like it had been built by hand, stone by careful stone. Temperance stood in the center of the main room, feeling too big, too awkward, too everything. Her arms wrapped around herself in that old protective gesture she'd learned as a child when the other kids had pelted her with rocks and called her Goliath's ugly daughter. Zeke set down her trunk and turned to face her, keeping distance between them. And she realized he was doing it on purpose, giving her space to breathe. "The bedroom is through that door," he said, pointing to the left. "It's yours, Miss Coldwell. I'll sleep out here on the settee until you're comfortable. Maybe forever if that's what you need. There's no rush on anything." Her head snapped up, confusion flooding through her. "You're not going to..." She couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't say the words her father had drilled into her head about marital duties and submission, and how a man who'd paid for her train ticket had every right to claim what he'd purchased.
"Not going to what?" Zeke asked gently, and there was no impatience in his voice, just genuine curiosity.
"Claim your rights," she whispered, the words tasting like ash.
"Tonight.
My father said that men who pay for passage expect immediate. He said, I should be grateful anyone would want a freakish giant like me, that I should submit without complaint to whatever you required, because no decent man would marry me otherwise." The room went very quiet, and when she finally dared to look at Zeke's face, she saw something that looked like barely controlled anger, but not at her.
"Never at her." "Your father?"
Zeke said slowly, each word measured and careful.
"Told you that?" She nodded, throat tight.
"He said, with someone like me, someone so big and unnatural, it would probably hurt worse than normal women, that I should just endure it and be thankful." Zeke's jaw clenched, and she watched him take a long breath through his nose, clearly fighting for control.
"Miss Coldwell, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear every word. I didn't buy you. I offered you an opportunity same as you offered me one. Partnership means respect. It means patience. It means I don't touch you until you want me to, if that day ever comes at all. And your father?" His voice dropped lower, intense. "Your father is a cruel man who broke something beautiful because he was too small-minded to see its value." Nobody had ever called her beautiful before. The word hit her like a physical blow, and suddenly she was crying. Great shaking sobs that she couldn't control, and she hated herself for it because giants weren't supposed to cry. Freaks weren't supposed to have feelings. Women like her were supposed to just endure and be grateful. But Zeke didn't laugh or look disgusted. He simply pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and said, "Sit down, Temperance. Let me make us some supper, and then you can sleep, and tomorrow we'll start figuring out how to be partners." He used her first name like it was something precious. And that made her cry harder. Over the next 3 weeks, Temperance learned things about Ezekiel Thornwood that slowly began to reshape everything she'd believed about men and marriage and herself. She learned that he'd been married before to a woman named Sarah, who died of fever 7 years ago, and that he still spoke about her with gentle fondness, but without the crushing grief that would have made Temperance feel like a replacement. She learned that he sang to his horses while he worked, old songs about lonesome cowboys in distant homes. She learned that he read Shakespeare by firelight and could quote whole passages of Romeo and Juliet, which seemed impossible for a rough Montana rancher until he explained that his mother had been a schoolteacher back in Virginia before the war. Most importantly, she learned that Zeke Thornwood kept his promises. He never entered her bedroom without knocking and waiting for permission. He never commented on how much she ate, even though she'd been trained to take small portions and leave the table hungry. Because giants who eat like giants just get more freakish.
He asked her opinion on things, real things, like which field should be planted first and whether the barn roof would hold through another winter. And slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice it happening, Temperance began to unfold. She started singing while she worked in the garden. She caught herself laughing at something Zeke said about the stubborn rooster. She stood up straight instead of hunching her shoulders. One morning in late October, she was hanging laundry when she heard horses approaching fast, and her stomach dropped because she recognized that sound from Pennsylvania from all the times her father's church friends had come to counsel her about her unwomanly height and improper demeanor. 3 men rode into the yard, rough-looking and armed, and the leader had a scar across his jaw that made him look mean even before he opened his mouth. Well, he drawled, swinging down from his saddle without invitation. Heard Thornwood got himself a mail-order bride.
Didn't believe it till now.
You're even bigger than they said at the saloon.
Temperance's hands clenched on the laundry basket, old fear flooding back. Mr. Thornwood isn't here right now. You should come back later.
The scarred man laughed and stepped closer, his eyes crawling over her body in that way that made her skin feel dirty.
We ain't here for Thornwood, sweetheart. We're here about the water rights. See my boss, Mr. Dalton Reeves.
He owns the land upstream and he's decided that creek running through this property, that's his water now.
We're just here to make sure you folks understand the new arrangement.
His companions spread out, flanking her, and she recognized this tactic because her father's friends had done the same thing, surrounding her, making her feel trapped and small despite her size. The creek's been here longer than any land claims, Temperance heard herself say, and she was amazed her voice didn't shake. Ezekiel has legal rights to this water. The scarred man's smile turned ugly.
Listen to that, boys. The giant's got opinions.
Tell you what, darling.
Why don't you invite us inside?
Show us some of that womanly hospitality, and maybe we'll be gentle when we deliver our message to your husband. The way he said hospitality made bile rise in her throat because she knew exactly what he meant. Had heard that same tone in Brother Hutchins' voice back in Pennsylvania. You need to leave, she said, backing toward the house.
Now.
The scarred man reached for her arm, his fingers closing around her wrist, and Temperance felt 26 years of fear and shame and powerlessness surge up through her chest, and she was opening her mouth to scream when a rifle shot cracked across the valley like the voice of God himself.
Or you'll answer to me.
Zeke's voice rang out from the barn entrance, and Temperance had never heard him sound like that before. Cold and deadly as January frost, his Winchester still smoking in his hands.
And that was a warning shot, gentlemen. Next one won't be.
The scarred man dropped her wrist like it had burned him, and all 3 intruders froze as Zeke walked forward with the calm, measured pace of a man who'd seen combat, and survived it. He positioned himself directly between Temperance and the riders, his body a living shield, and she could see the rigid line of his shoulders, the way his jaw was clenched so tight it must have hurt. Tell Dalton Reeves that I've got legal claim to this land and every drop of water on it filed proper with the territorial office in Helena. Tell him if he wants to dispute it, he can take it up with the court. And tell him if any of his men set foot on my property again. If they so much as look at my wife wrong, they'll be leaving in pine boxes. The way Zeke said my wife made something warm and fierce bloom in Temperance's chest because he didn't say it like she was property. He said it like she was something worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth dying for. The scarred man spat in the dust, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. Reeves don't like being told no Thornwood. He's got friends. He's got money and he's got patience. This ain't over. Not by a long shot. And that freak you married. He jerked his chin toward Temperance. She ain't worth dying over. Zeke's voice dropped even lower, quiet as a grave and twice as final. That's where you're wrong. Now get off my land before I forget. I'm trying to be civilized. The 3 men mounted up, muttering threats. But they rode away. And Temperance stood there shaking, not from fear anymore, but from something else entirely. Something that felt like lightning in her veins. When the dust settled and silence returned to the ranch, Zeke finally lowered the rifle and turned to face her, and she saw real fear in his eyes for the first time since they'd met.
Did they hurt you?
he asked, his hands moving like he wanted to touch her to check for injuries, but stopping himself because he'd promised her control over her own body.
Tell me they didn't hurt you, Temperance.
No, she managed, her voice coming out stronger than she expected.
You came back just in time.
He closed his eyes briefly, relief washing over his face. And then he did something that surprised her. He sat down right there in the dirt, his legs suddenly unsteady, the rifle across his knees, and she realized he'd been terrified, genuinely terrified of what might have happened if he'd been 30 seconds later. I saw them from the north pasture, he said quietly.
Rode hellbent for home. Thought my heart would explode before I got here. Temperance walked over slowly and did something she'd never done before.
Something that 3 weeks of his patient kindness had made possible. She reached out and touched his shoulder, just a light touch, her large hand gentle on his sun-warmed shirt. He looked up at her like she'd given him something precious.
Temperance, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it true. Dalton Reeves is a powerful man.
He owns half the territory, has the sheriff in his pocket, and he doesn't stop when he wants something.
This isn't over. Things are going to get dangerous here.
His voice cracked slightly. If you want to leave, if you want me to arrange passage back to Pennsylvania or anywhere else you'd rather be, I'll understand.
I won't hold you to our agreement.
The old Temperance, the broken one her father had created, would have run, would have believed she wasn't worth the trouble, wasn't worth the danger. But something had changed in these 3 weeks of being treated like a human being instead of a burden. Do you want me to leave? She asked, and her voice was steady. Zeke's answer came fast and raw, stripped of all pretense.
God, no. Having you here, it's like the house remembers how to breathe again. Like, I remember how to breathe. But Temperance, I want you to be safe more than I want you to stay.
She looked at this man who'd kept every promise, who'd given her space and respect and kindness without asking for anything in return, who just stood between her and violence without hesitation. And she made a decision that would change everything. I'm not leaving, she said firmly.
This is my home now. We're partners. You said so yourself.
Partners don't run when things get hard. Something shifted in Zeke's expression.
Something deep and profound.
And he stood slowly, dusting off his pants. Partners, he repeated softly. Then we face whatever comes together. The attack started small.
A fence cut here. Cattle spooked there.
Supplies gone missing from the barn.
Reeves was testing them, seeing if they'd break.
But what he didn't understand was that Temperance Coldwell had spent 26 years surviving her father's cruelty. And Ezekiel Thornwood had survived a war and the death of his first love.
They weren't the breaking kind. They worked from dawn to dusk, repairing damage, strengthening defenses, building something that felt more solid every day.
And somewhere in those long autumn days, working side by side, sharing meals and stories in comfortable silences, Temperance realized something terrifying.
She was falling in love with her husband.
Not the beautiful, fearful submission her father had described, but real love. The kind that made her heart race when Zeke smiled at her. The kind that made her want to reach for his hand. The kind that made her lie awake at night in her separate bedroom, wondering what it would feel like to ask him to kiss her. The first snow came in early November, sealing them in with white silence. And one night by the fire, Zeke was reading aloud from Romeo and Juliet, his voice giving life to Shakespeare's words about love and longing.
And Temperance couldn't take it anymore.
Zeke, she interrupted, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. He looked up from the book, firelight catching in his eyes.
Could you teach me something?
He sat down the book immediately, giving her his full attention.
Anything? What do you need?
She stood up on shaking legs and walked over to where he sat, and she must have looked terrified because he stood too, concern creasing his forehead.